so I don't forget. Thank you. And we might wait just a couple more minutes as everyone gets their bearings and comes back into the room. Thanks, everyone. So I'm Rachel Wilson. I also work at RMIT with most of the organisers. Like most people, I'd like to acknowledge the elders, warriors and activists of the Coort Willam people of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded land I'm currently conducting the work of the university. I acknowledge that learning, loving and creativity have been taking place on these lands for millennia. Always has been, always will be Aboriginal land. So welcome to the Alternate World session, the penultimate session of today's symposium. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Joymi Baker, who is also my lovely colleague teaching in the cinema here at RMIT, cinema program that is. The topic of her talk is The Stranger, 1964 to 1965, Environmental Refugees of a Poisoned World. So over to you, Joymi.
Rachel, are you able to see my presentation now?
So, yes, thanks. Sorry, Joymi, just trying to get my mouse back to mute.
I know it's a bit like that. It's as soon as you start pressing things, everything goes a bit crazy. All right. So Wominjeka, so I want to begin by acknowledging the people of the Woiwurrung language group as I'm presenting on their unceded lands, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that to all First Peoples from wherever you may be coming from. So as you'll gather from the title, it's a little bit different. Many of the presentations in the symposium so far, at least the ones I've been to, have been looking at contemporary eco-media practices. My paper, by contrast, is looking at the depiction of environmental refugees in an Australian family television program that broadcast from 1964 to 1965 called The Stranger. And this was the first science fiction drama program to be made locally in Australia. And through the 60s and 70s, the ABC worked with collaboration with Transa Park Studios in Sydney, and they produced 7 science fiction dramas in that period. Now, The Stranger starred Rod Hadrick as a mysterious newcomer called Adam, who turns out to be one of a group of aliens fleeing their poisoned homeworld. The alien Socionites have spent generations looking for a new home, such that Adam and his shipmate Verossa never had a chance themselves to see the plants, trees, and animals that once lived on their own homeworld before an unspecified ecological accident sterilized the planet. Seen through their alien eyes, the natural world on Earth is both wondrous and alarming. And there's one fleeting moment from the show that I think captures this contradictory response to life on Earth. So at this point, I'm going to show you a very brief clip from the show with a little tinkering from me at the end. So the last part is intentionally silent.
We will go now with Verossa. Persisti. Persisti. Machine is inside.
Now, as I mentioned, I've obviously deliberately tinkered with this clip to repeat Verossa's startled and even fearful reaction to the song of the Kookaburra. Scott McDonald argues that eco-media should ideally involve what he calls a retraining of perception. In The Stranger, the audience is encouraged to take up the perspective of aliens for whom the Australian bush is newly strange. In this, the program enacts the estrangement that Darko Suvin asserted was central to science fiction as a genre. In other words, there's an intersection in this particular case between the goals of eco-criticism and the genre conventions of science fiction in getting us to look and listen to our world in new ways. If for Adam, the sound of the off-screen kookaburra is a source of joy, for Verossa, it's deeply unsettling. It's only Verossa's alien origin at this stage that accounts for this reaction, and it's only later in this episode that we find out about the ecological collapse of his homeworld. So Verossa is alarmed not only because the kookaburra is a sound of an unfamiliar alien being on an alien planet, he's alarmed because he's never heard the sound of any living being other than his own species. As Simon Spiegel notes, it's a common trope in the science fiction film to allow us, and I quote, to literally see with strange eyes. So by way of example, we might think of the computer HAL in Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey from 1968, with whom the audience shares point of view shots. For Spiegel, this is an act of naturalization, so taking something strange and making it seem normal because we're seeing through HAL's eyes. By contrast, in Richard Fleischer's Soylent Green from 1973, when Charlton Heston's character Thorne is elated by a simple bar of soap, Spiegel writes, it's essentially Thorne's behaviour that creates this effect of estrangement. So this is a case of something normal, a piece of soap, that becomes strange through Thorne. So similarly for Australian audiences, the kookaburra itself is in no way strange. It's the reaction of Adam and Verossa that makes it newly strange, simultaneously joyfully precious and alarmingly unfamiliar. This is not necessarily the case for audiences outside of Australia, and in this respect, it's significant that The Stranger was one of the first Australian television programs of any genre to be sold overseas when it was picked up by the BBC. In the popular press in Australia, the show was used to discuss the local television industry's international viability more broadly, and it's clear that the production was deliberately aiming for this export potential. The spaceship was one of the most expensive props the ABC had ever made, and it was boasted that the show used 40 different sets and location shooting, and that's quite unusual for family and children's shows in this era. So that location shooting included getting the CSIRO to give permission for actors to climb all over the park's observatory in season 2. Press articles of the time stressed the show's expense, its attention to detail, its authenticity, all elements that were tied in those articles to the show's perceived quality. So when a favourable review in Britain suggested that all children's producers should be taking a look at it, it was gleefully circulated in an ABC inter-office memo, and then it was aggressively pitched to the Australian media, who took it up with relish in numerous publications. So initially, I actually thought that in England there must have been lots of different press clippings about this show, but it all actually was just the one that got distributed. The show was written by G.K. Saunders, an English writer who moved to Australia in 1939. After working with the CSIRO during World War II, he went on to write a variety of science fiction radio serials for the ABC. And then he moved back to England in 1957, where he was writing for the BBC radio, but continued to work for the ABC in both radio and television. So this makes The Stranger an Australian program written by an Englishman and based in part on his memories of living in Australia. As someone who worked for both the BBC and the ABC, he was ideally placed to consider both marketplaces when devising the show. Alan McKee argues that notions of Britishness became bound up in the cultural identity of the ABC in this period in Australia. Conversely, for British audiences, the sound of the kookaburra is an exotic oddity, aligning them more easily with that outsider perspective of aliens Adam and Barossa. Adam, Barossa and the Socinites seek to become new Australians, to use the post-war immigrant terminology of the day. Since the late 19th century, Australian literary science fiction had used the genre to explore what-if scenarios of foreign invasion. As Mary Louise Pratt argues, science fiction creates a contact zone between cultures. And this is a concept that Brian Atterbury suggests is fruitful when thinking about cultural and racial relations and exclusions in Australian science fiction, including Indigenous and immigrant exclusions. Adam and Barossa look white, yet they don't neatly fit the Anglo-centric white Australia policy of this era, in that they are quite literally alien. In this way, they stand in for settler and immigrant narratives invested in different ways in the status of the alien and alien lands. The post-war refugee influx into Australia meant that by 1966, the year after The Stranger wrapped up, 1 out of every 7 Australians was born overseas. The migrant narrative of assimilation in The Stranger ultimately overshadows the environmental themes that place the Socinites' need for a new home in the first place. Yet from the 21st century eyes, in the midst as we are in an ever-impending environmental disaster, it's the sound of an off-screen unseen kookaburra and Barossa's response to it that stayed with me. And this for me is an interspecies contact zone. Jonathan Burt suggests that the non-human animal is, and I quote, a rupture in the field of representation, in which our attention is constantly drawn beyond the image. It constantly points beyond itself, end quote. But in the case of this segment from The Stranger, we don't actually see the kookaburra. This is an off-screen acousmatic sound, to use Michelle Chion's term. Chion suggests the voice, when it comes from an unseen face, creates a special being, a kind of talking and acting shadow. Murray Pomerantz expresses it as a moment of haunting. He writes, "Look," it says, "from a position we cannot identify, in a space with which we are not intimate, so that, looking, we seem to experience more than the eye can see." Here, Pomerantz prioritizes the effective force of the moment over that of the sequential narrative. The power of the moment, Chion suggests, dissipates as soon as the source of the sound is shown. That we never see the kookaburra in this sequence is most likely for purely pragmatic production reasons. This is most likely just a sound out of their stock. Yet its effect, whether intended or unintended, is to create a rupture in The Stranger, which for me punctuates its ecological message, even as the narrative force, the sequential narrative, tries to bury it underneath this tale of alien immigrants. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. I didn't even have to ding you with my water bottle, which I was going to borrow Heather's strategy for in terms of timekeeping. So thanks very much for keeping to time there. It was fantastic. And I'm looking forward to the conversations that will flow at the end of the session. Our next speaker is Andre Balsanice Gonçalves, and he's coming from the Open University in Catalonia, and his paper is called Sporita Vita, a science, technology and fictional studies experiment on space infrastructures in a degrowth future. So over to you, Andrew.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay.
Very well.
Cool. Okay, I will share my screen. First of all, then I will have to apologize for my English, because I'm not a native speaker and from that. And also because I have a sore throat, so I might cough at some point. Okay, so let me put the the chronometer, so I know where I am. Today I will talk about what I call the growth sci-fi research, or the growth science fictional research. It was in the beginning, it was a commission of the Center for Contemporary Culture of Barcelona for an exhibition on Mars that took place at the beginning of this year, and they invited me because for quite a long time I've been investigating in the convergence between narratives, fictions, and imaginaries, and infrastructure, regulations, and material research in science and technology. So I wanted to make an exercise of theory fiction, departing from the book of Dreamscapes of Modernity from Chazanov and Kim. And in this book, that I'm sure that some of you are familiar with it, they describe socio-technical imaginaries as collective visions of the future that are structured and held and sustained by institutions, and those socio-technical imaginaries, those visions of the future, are publicly performed, I don't know, through launching of rockets from, for example, when the Deep Blue won the world champion at Go, for example, this is a public performance of techno-scientific power as well. And behind those performance and those socio-technical imaginaries are understandings of social life and social order. No? So there is a normative power behind them, and at the same time there is also like an aspirational inertia or will. So based on the work of Chazanov and Kim, I did a small list of functions that technoscientific systems serve, just to give you a little bit of context. And after that, I will share with you my project. Well, so the first of all is that technoscientific systems can create consensus in the sense that they synchronize eyes and ears to agree on something that needs to be known, or a way of understanding the world. No, it also conduces collective desires for logic and order, producing representation of how the world works. In this sense, for example, the human DNA sequencing is a really good example, because it not only depicts a way of understanding human life in a radically new way, but also it embeds the promise that this medical science achievement will bring us, I don't know, new ways of healing us, a new way of understanding us as biological beings. The technoscientific systems as well, they project achievable and promising futures, like for example, like, well, now that the Perseverance is crawling Mars, and the fact that this vehicle is there grabbing like objective facts for us to understand how the planet works, is also feeding the dreams of some people, to the dreams or the deliriums of some people to go there and to set a colony there. No, so at the same time, like Perseverance, it's embedding a colonialist, an extractivist narrative that is performed by crazy billionaires like Elon Musk, for example. And of course, technoscientific systems also project futures to be shunned or avoided, no? Which is like an increasingly important part in the work of socio-technical imaginaries, like the IPCC report that was recently published, which is full of warnings. And those warnings, what they do is they fuel expectations that wants to activate action to avoid more disasters. So like in a nutshell, this is like a small map of how I consider fiction in this context. No, I try to to look at technoscientific apparatus, and at the same time at the technopolitical order, understanding technology as a construction and a convention that embeds the interest and the ideology of the elites that has produced them. No, so there is this triangle between power, future, and knowledge that is inhabited or excited or lubricated by speculation as the act of projecting towards the future, expectations as the act of waiting something to happen from the latent expectare, no? As there is a passive gesture in the expectations, but at the same time it's highly performative because expectations make us act in the present to avoid or pursue abstract futures. And of course, both speculations and expectations are fueled by promises expelled by governments, corporations, think tanks, international organizations that tells us if we do this, we will achieve this, no? Or if we don't this, we will end up here. So what I try to explain in my research or to experiment with is an epistemological unit and a relational phenomena that I call sociotechnical fiction. No, it's a highly performative idea, a highly performative and material idea of fiction that is widely explained in this research platform. I show it here just in case you want to check it out. And this is the project that I wanted to show you. What is called Spora Evita. Spora Evita, it's an agency. This is the commission of the Center for Contemporary Culture of Barcelona, and Spora Evita, it's the agency of space pollination. No, it's in a distant future, and this work, which was displayed in big panels, is like 120 per 2 meters. It shows 2 different stages. No, this black poster, it's like the official presentation of Spora Evita. No, it's like a product that this space agency does to explain itself. And this is the result of the research of a science and technology studies researcher of this future that has done to analyze how Spora Evita is working to reproduce certain forms of hegemony and certain myths of this future. So now I will share with you the poster in a little bit more of detail. So that's the Spora Evita, as I said, the agency for space pollination. Space pollination, because I wanted to explicitly avoid or criticize this idea of space colonization and this extractivist dynamics of billionaires going to space to commodify it. So Spora Evita is set in the year 86 post-collapse, which is like about 100 years in the future, and is set in a post-collapse civilization raised upon a collective trauma after a massive ecocide, which is what we are where we are right now as a civilization. The main driver of this global society is not wealth accumulation, as it happens in capitalist societies, but the ecstatic reproduction of life. In this new civilization that has raised from the ashes of the capitalist civilization, they've managed to mitigate climate disaster and restitute ecosystems and disappeared species using automated biotechnology and geoengineering. This mutation of the planet goes hand by hand to a human transformation, what is called the reenchantment, el reencantamiento en español, castellano. And the reenchantment, what has been done is using biotechnology to augment human sentience sentience, sorry, in order to develop ecognosis. Ecognosis, as you know, is this concept developed by Timothy Morton. So in this future, humans are using different kinds of biotechnology to augment our consciousness and intelligence, so we can connect to the planet and to other human beings in another way. So the reenchantment is the fundamental myth of this new civilization, and it's and the main entity of this mythology is the planet Earth, no? But the planet Earth in this context is rebaptized, no, or renamed, and it's called Gaia, as you can read here, no? So here Gaia, it's not only the planet, but also its inhabitants and the objects that populate this planet, no? So Gaia acknowledges the natural nature of the planet, but also the artificial nature of the planet. So it's like a cyborg Gaia in this case, no? It's acknowledging both wires, satellites, undersea wires, for example, as an integral part of the planet. So how does it work, this space agency? So basically, every 57 years, there is a random selection of 112 individuals that voluntarily take part of this program. What happens is that, of course, for the individuals of this new civilization, it's a honor to take part of Spora Vita because Spora Vita is also conceived as the reproductive organ of Gaia. And the people who take part of the program, they became like this. They became the sporaes of this planetary entity, which is Gaia, and they are transformed to go to Mars and to install life there, no? Which is one of the fundamental mandates of the Reenchanted myth, is to reproduce life, no? As I said before. So the way that the life is reproduced is through the installation of the prebiotic soup, or what is also called the Abiogenesis program. And basically what they do is to install this a big infrastructure with a chemical compounds made of inorganic elements like silicon, nitrogen, and nitrogen that is sealed and exposed to light, and it will create Marshall cell divisions in 6,000 years. No? So there is a different time scale, a very different time scale than the one that we're using today. And now I wanted to show you the other part of the research. I don't know if it's not working well. Well, I will explain it anyways. The other poster, the one that I wanted to here. This poster, it's explaining the research that analyzes Spora Vita both as hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. Regarding to the hard infrastructure, the material infrastructure, the research depicts what kind of objects and events of technoscientific performance they use to then reproduce hegemony, create consensus. No? Objects like, for example, samples of Mars, or a 24/7 streaming of the prebiotic soup. Then here there is an abstract on some of the features of the reenchantment, like for example that any technology or scientific innovation needs to be addressed to the reproduction of life, or for example that the values and symbol and the capitalist values and symbol are obnoxious, like it happens with fascist symbols today. Then they build legitimacy, for example, when they launch the rockets, it becomes for the whole population of the Earth a moment of joy and celebration, because the life it's going to the space to spread. Something that I didn't say is that the kind of life that the prebiotic soup is trying to install in Mars is not an earthly life. It's an indigenous life, no, a Martian life. And there is something that is quite interesting that that I found in this theory fiction research, that is the fact that because the prebiotic soup, it takes like 6,000 years to happen, it becomes like a deep time spectacle that manages the chronopolitics of this new society, you know. And now, just to finish, in these gray areas of the poster, what the visitors could discover is that at the end, Spora Vita is not sending anyone to Mars. When people arrive to Spora Vita, when the volunteers arrive to Spora Vita, they are taught that they need to pretend to go to Mars and to keep producing fake material proofs. So Spora Vita works as a device of political management of the future, because the main objective of Spora Vita is to control control the specter of ecocidal progress of capitalism. No, so it's a knowledge infrastructure designed to manage the socio-technical imaginaries, so they can control what are the imaginaries of the future. Okay, that's all.
Thank you so much, Andre. That was fascinating, and I'm looking forward to having a broader conversation about this world 6,000 years in the future for us. Yeah, I was really impressed with your overt conversations around the politics of this kind of space. So thank you very much. Now, everyone, I'm going to have a go at getting Mick's presentation up. So just give me a couple of seconds while I figure out how to do it via my sharing screen. So thanks for your patience. Professor Mick Brogdon is our recently appointed adjunct professor here at RMIT, previously of Murdoch University in Western Australia. His presentation is the film as mutation, British nuclear tests in Australia 1952 to 1963. And I must admit to having a personal connection a little bit to this work. My father was, in fact, witness to 6 atomic bomb detonations in the Pacific region. And Mick, at one point, just as he was entering into dementia, did go and speak to my father and show some of the films, and it was a very powerful moment in my family history. So it's interesting to see his work continue in this space. So just bear with me as I get the presentation up.
During the Cold War, a major series of British atomic nuclear tests was conducted in Australia, first on uninhabited islands off the northwestern coast and at remote, sparsely populated locations in central southern Australia. After the initial nuclear trials at the Montebello Islands and Emu Field, a permanent test site was established at Maralinga in South Australia. In addition, several hundred top-secret so-called minor trials were conducted from 1955 to 1963 in order to test weapons safety by subjecting radioactive materials to fire and high explosives. Over 30,000 British and Australian service personnel and civilians were involved in these nuclear trials. Subsequently, after more than 2 decades of whistleblower accounts and increasing controversy, a wide-ranging Australian Royal Commission was established in the mid-1980s to investigate the conduct of the British nuclear testing program. It sought to establish lines of Anglo-Australian authority and responsibility in the efficacy of the weapons trials and document the impact on military participants, nearby Indigenous communities, downwind rural and urban populations, and flora and fauna. Amongst the evidence presented to the Commission, headed by Justice Jim McClelland, were thousands of official documents and photographs and films recording the atomic detonations. However, several of these film records were incomplete or remained secret and unseen, as subsequent declassifications over the years have demonstrated. Hence, this paper considers as visible evidence previously unknown or withheld films as both raw and edited footage that possess the latent potential of filmic mutation. That is, evolving from the tech's original utilitarian or propagandist use to be recast as corroborative data that may serve to verify disputed claims by civilian and nuclear service veterans of occupational or environmental harm, particularly from inhalation, ingestion and accidental injection caused by exposure to radioactive fallout from weapons tests and or lingering ecological contamination. But please note here that it's beyond the scope of today's presentation to scrutinise documentary and data films in relation to important parallel claims made by dispossessed First Nations people and their descendants regarding individual and community health effects and impacts upon traditional lands. Corresponding with the rapid technological advances during the Second World War, such as radar, jet propulsion, V-weapons and atomic bombs, was the development of film technologies to record these scientific advances. As Susan Courtney has observed, the history of nuclear weapons is also, in several crucial aspects, a history of moving images. Paul Virilio has noted the cinematic apparatus has been intrinsically linked with militaristic pursuits from its inception, both as a documentary tool for propagandising and also as an instrument for the recording of data. In relation to American nuclear film tests, media anthropologist Joe Masco has underscored their lasting significance as a curious archive of scientific fact, speculation and outright propaganda, and a cinematic repository that became the crucial way in which the government communicated the weapons' power to soldiers, civilians and policymakers alike. Similarly, screen media maker and historian John Hughes has examined the problematic relationship between Australian government agencies established to generate, curate and or archive documentary film, noting, quote, both government and non-government film production for training, research and public relations are under-examined in Australia. Vernacular moving image production dedicated to precise, localised purposes of collecting evidence of scientific observation, research, training and instruction, given close examination, can deliver striking insights well beyond the instrumental purposes that animated their original intentions, unquote. The following brief examples of such footage are comprised of raw data film, often edited into narrative documentary, sometimes accompanied with an unseen narrator's voice to provide didactic instruction or explanation. Most of these films and their original unedited rushes were classified and covered by the UK Official Secrets Acts, not to be disseminated to the general public, nor to those without the requisite security clearance. By juxtaposing recorded evidence and official findings from the Royal Commission against close readings of raw and or edited film sequences of the British nuclear tests conducted in Australia, inconsistencies and contradictions can be detected that may serve to confirm or dispute the historical and contemporary scientific determinations concerning radiation impacts. In order to gesture towards the effects of occupational and environmental exposure to radioactive elements, this footage will be discussed using two brief case studies from the minor trials of the early 1960s. A recently declassified film title produced for the British Atomic Weapons Research Establishment, AWRE, film unit, titled Vixen A, Spring 1960, sheds new light on the formerly top-secret program of experimentation that was conducted to understand how certain components of atomic weapons performed in varying conditions, as opposed to the 12 major atmospheric atomic weapons detonations from 1952 to 57. Codenamed Vixen A and Vixen B, they were, according to the Royal Commission, quote, allegedly designed to test the safety of nuclear weapons during storage and in extreme conditions such as fire, unquote. Vixen A Spring 1960 documents one brief period of the multi-year series to, quote, study the spread of radioactive and toxic materials that might result from an accident, unquote. From 1959 to 1961, 31 Vixen A experiments deliberately released highly radioactive material into the environment at a site north of the Maralinga village. This included scores of kilograms of uranium, beryllium, plutonium, polonium and actinium. The film segment of specific interest occurs on the Mulga Flats at the Maralinga site and also inside a small laboratory. Scientists are shown next to a 4-metre high chimney, inserting and then removing a small metal mesh basket containing hand-sized blocks of the nuclear material, which is uranium, to be oxidised, placing it inside a, quote, electrically heated combustion apparatus, unquote, and attaching electrodes. They wear linen coveralls and rubber gloves, but no one dons a mask. The electric generator is switched to full capacity. A brief montage displays various instruments downwind, arranged to measure the aerosolized radioactive particles. After the experiment concludes, quick shots reveal several men standing before the open apparatus, without masks, one of whom steps up to peer inside, his face mere centimetres from where the uranium was burnt and electrified. While the image also appears to show the man's film badge attached at waist height to his trousers, it clearly demonstrates the close proximity and inhalation danger from such behaviour. This is followed immediately by a close-up of the remnants of the disintegrated block that had been collected on a metal tray, now placed on the ground for observation. A pair of gloved hands rotates the broken metal basket as chunks of the incinerated material fall onto the tray and is blown about by the wind. The mise-en-scene and continuity editing strongly implies that the scientist rotating the basket is still unmasked and crouching low to the ground. A jump cut then shows the same scientist entering a laboratory, carrying the radioactive remnants in a polythene bag. The narrator asserts, quote, chemical analysis must be used to assess the health hazard of the toxic materials, unquote. However, the following sequence suggests scientific participants were themselves exposed to inhalation hazards in the very process of conducting such assessments. A young technician wearing a white AWRE lab coat and rubber gloves is next shown preparing a sample of the material for analysis by baking, dissolving and heating the radioactive residue. Throughout this procedure, the technician and his colleague are seen in cutaways at arm's length or less without a mask, while fumes continually rise from the radioactive sample as it is subjected to nitric and perchloric acids or when vaporized under heat lamps. Case Study B, Operation Cleanup, showcases the second series, Vixen B, which occurred from 1960 to 63 at Maralinga's Taranaki site, also the 1957 location of the largest atmospheric nuclear detonation on the Australian mainland at 25 kilotons. These Vixen B safety experiments were similarly designed to test atomic weapons functions in the event of an accident, such as from a crash or a fire while in transit or storage, and to push the limits of these hazards under controlled experimental conditions, but without causing a nuclear detonation. Unlike the explosions in the Vixen A trials, noted above, these Vixen B high explosives designed to implode the fissile cores of plutonium and uranium released enough energy to spread radiological contaminants many kilometres across the Taranaki site. Relevant documentary footage of the environmental impact of the Vixen B trials, not available to the Royal Commission in 1984, has now been declassified. Operation Cleanup, 1960, for example, details survey teams assessing radiation hazards at the Vixen B site and showcases various methods for removing contaminated soil and debris, including heavy metal plates that are all dumped in nearby burial pits. The most relevant sequence in Operation Cleanup, never before released to the public, shows the results of the Vixen B trials conducted on weighty steel structures designated, quote, featherbeds, unquote. The Vixen B series employed high explosives configured to only partly implode fissile cores of plutonium and uranium, which serve to spread radiological contaminants over a large area. The narrator explains, quote, "Prior to the removal of the wrecked steelworks, the debris was liberally sprayed with a water-based sealing material to prevent the unnecessary spread of radiation during dismantling operations and to reduce the hazard to personnel working amongst the debris," unquote. Approximately 600 minor trials were conducted at Maralinga with long-lasting impact on the environment, such as that recorded above. The amount and spread of highly toxic radioactive material, much of it long-lived alpha emitters, deliberately dispersed around the Taranaki site was substantial. It included scores of kilograms of beryllium, plutonium and uranium. According to the Royal Commission, the Taranaki Vixen B rounds, quote, "produced the worst of the contaminated areas at Maralinga," unquote, with the Commission concluding that, quote, "in view of the known long half-life of plutonium, 24,000 years, the Vixen series should never have been conducted at Maralinga," unquote. The next Operation Cleanup sequence concentrates on one of the featherbed decontamination crew members who was returned from the forward area. The film records him proceeding through the numerous health physics caravans in an ordered stage, from an initial monitoring of radioactive sources on outer clothing and boots, through to successive shredding of his protective clothes prior to washing and monitoring. In a separate trailer, the man is filmed while being stripped of his undergarments and socks. The narrator explains, quote, "soiled clothing, roughly segregated according to levels of activity, is packed in bins lined with paper or PVC bags and eventually transported to the active laundry," unquote. The man is then shown showering and being remonitored for radioactivity. What happens to the garments is revealed later. The next scene records two men outdoors in full protective clothing, decontaminating a return vehicle from the active area using high-pressure steam hosing and then a vacuum cleaner on the exterior. However, the next sequence, handheld and in medium close-up, comprises several brief cuts showing a technician, unmasked, facing downwards to monitor the interior of the vehicle for radioactivity from about waist height. Next, a maskless worker in coveralls and wearing rubber gloves is filmed, handheld, moving contaminated clothing from a pile into an industrial-sized front-loading washing machine. This repeated movement records him passing the clothes mere centimetres from his unshielded face. A second worker, similarly attired in coveralls and gloves but also unmasked, is shown opening and leaning into a still tumbling air dryer to remove clothing, before finally passing a radiation counter over items of clothing on a nearby bench. During these sequences, the narration remains authoritative, perfunctory and reassuring. Yet a number of troubling questions arise from these clean-up sequences. Firstly, while steam is shown blasting a vehicle from high-pressure hoses, with corresponding vapour escaping into the surrounding atmosphere, there is no evidence that anything is done to contain the localised site contamination caused by the aerosolised cleaning. The procedure takes place in the open, outdoors, suggesting radioactive particles are left to fall out and settle on the surrounding terrain. Secondly, unmasked health workers engaged in the monitoring of field equipment are seen working in close proximity and likely exposed to particle inhalation risk. Thirdly, unmasked AWER staff are shown as particularly vulnerable to alpha particles through their observed activities while moving contaminated clothing in and out of industrial cleaning machines. As with the steam pressure hose example, no mention is made of the radioactive contaminant runoff from the washing or the venting of particles from the laundry clothes dryer. Finally, it is unclear whether the invisible camera operators and crew tasked with recording these events were fitted with the requisite protective standard for health and safety, or were similarly unmasked at such times, exposing them to the same inhalation, ingestion and injection hazards. In conclusion, it appears both paradoxical and ironic that, while concerted attention was paid in these utilitarian AWRE films to specifically showcase safety and the health physics at the nuclear test sites, these same documentary productions inadvertently reveal the inconsistencies and failures of procedures that may well have endangered the health of test participants. In light of this, numerous British films of the nuclear tests in Australia can now be appreciated as having mutated into new forms of visible evidence, over and above their intended and explicit purpose. Instead of providing reassurance as to the veracity of the safety procedures for personnel on the test ranges, they depict numerous instances of concern regarding occupational exposure to radioactive material, especially internal pathways into the body from alpha emitters such as plutonium and uranium. A retrospective analysis of British nuclear test films, as they become further declassified, should provide additional evidence by which participants and their descendants can assess official claims of safety made by successive governments in the past and into the future. Thanks.
Hi everyone, welcome back. And I do apologise because I was the one who put that little video together for Mick, so if there's a few little timing issues there, that's all on me. Anyway, back to the questions. I've noticed everyone's been incredibly polite in the previous sessions that I've been in, so I'm hoping that we can be a bit more raucous in this one. So feel free to put your hands up, just put your microphone on, and let's see if we can get a bit more of a conversation happening. So if anyone has any further questions, feel free to put your hand up and go for it. Even if the participants speak amongst themselves, that'd be great too. Mark, you're off. Just don't ask Mick one because he's not here.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. I had a question for Joymi. I had a colleague at Monash, Tony Moore, who used to work for the ABC, who has always lamented that the ABC didn't do more genre fiction, and in particular, science fiction. I just wonder whether you had any reflections on that. There was a recent counterexample was Glitch. I don't know if you would know that. I thought that was quite nice as an education around Australian history. Was able to do certain things in an entertaining format. I just wondered whether you had any, if you were advising the ABC, whether you would suggest they do more genre fiction, and if they did, whether there's potential in it for environmental education.
Oh, they're big questions. Well, I mean, as a genre fan, my obvious response would be yes. I think that in the contemporary TV ecology, we're a bit disadvantaged with the peak of quality TV that requires such an expensive outlay. And it's interesting because in the early days of TV, sci-fi was considered an inappropriate genre for the medium because it was seen as a spectacle genre. It was just too costly in the early days of TV, which is why it tended to pop up in children's and family shows as opposed to adult shows. Like the adult sci-fi shows came a good deal later. And ironically, I think that that's still an issue. But having said that, you can do really quite effective sci-fi without spectacle with really good writing. Glitch, I think it was a little clunky towards the end, but I think that is an interesting case though, where it shows you can do very nationally specific narratives around Indigenous and settler trauma, and use the science fictional conventions in order to delve into those quite deep chasms in the Australian psyche. So that part of it I thought worked well. But yeah, I think it's a marketplace issue, as it always is, but very specific to genre fiction in terms of what audiences expect, especially since with things like Netflix, sci-fi in the streaming area has become very flashy and very expensive. So that kind of prices us out a little bit. Yeah, so it definitely has that potential to play a role. I mean, it is the genre par excellence, I think, to deal with eco issues, but there are industry reasons.
Thanks, Joimi. I do actually have a question because no one else has put that. Oh, yes, they have. Logan, you go for it.
Thanks. No, I was just going to extend on that and just ask, like, is there a flourishing low budget genre area on YouTube? Like, are there small serials that are flourishing? That sparked my interest.
Yeah, in terms of Australian content specifically, Logan, or just in general?
Australian, perhaps. I mean, like, yeah.
It's actually kind of gone in even kind of lower fi than that, because I can think it's gone into podcasting, like serials.
Oh, wow.
Like, you know, sci-fi TV comes from sci-fi radio serials, and now it's gone back into podcast series.
Great.
Because it's so cheap and easy to do, but you can still get all the ideas across. But as for YouTube, I don't know. Yeah. I have a question for Andre.
It might be the same as mine. So you go for it, Joimi.
Oh, okay. So Andre, you know, I love you really pulled that twist on us at the end, that it's all, you know, it's all fakery and what have you. And I guess I was interested in how those posters were installed at the exhibition, and the fact that info, from what I could tell, you're saying that info about it being kind of fake is sort of grayed out. It's kind of faint. So in other words, you know, with the person at the exhibition, they're invested in all this story, and then they get to the end and they go, oh, hang on. Is that how it was kind of played out in the exhibition?
Well, thank you for the question and for your presentation as well. Well, I would like to talk a little bit about what you were presenting about the strangeness and so on. But well, the installation was at the end of the exhibition. It was and it was confronted with other visions of the future of other, like, physicists or, I don't know, anthropologists who were working with that. In terms of reception, a lot of people like looked at the posters, like in general, not going into detail. But the people who went into, because it's kind of dense, and it kind of takes time to go into the content. I'm not sure, being critical to my own work, I'm not sure this is the right format, but I was the CCCB was asking me to do like something like very simple. I think that what my proposal would work a little bit better with some video or some sound, so you get to know, like, the whole storytelling part happens easily, and then the research, which is the hardest part, you can digest it.
So I'm going to have to wind it up, but you have actually just answered my question, Andrew, which was, have you got any ideas about the future in terms of at least its representation beyond the poster? Because I think it's a deeply fascinating piece of work, and we'd love to see it realised, those of us who are media makers in some form. I'm going to have to wind it up because I'll get into trouble from Dan, but hopefully we can pick up on the conversation in the drinks after the next session. So thanks everybody, and see you in the next session. Well done. Excellent.